Welcome to The Global and the Granite State, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us for this month's conversation, whether you are a first-time or a long-time listener. By engaging in our global community, you are taking a seat at the table and help shape the world one conversation at a time. For those who don't know, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, a nonprofit, nonpartisan, community-based organization that is dedicated to helping you better understand the complex issues facing the world today. I'm also your host for this monthly podcast, a critical part of our work. None of this would be possible without the strong support of a wonderful, globally minded community. Thank you to all of our members, donors, and sponsors who provide the resources necessary to make this and all of our programs possible. To find out more about how you can support our global efforts, please visit our website at wacnh.org. A special thank you to our series sponsor, McLean Middleton, a strong community partner who ensures amazing conversations continue to drive the world forward. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 100 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. Now, let's get to today's discussion. When I first reached out to Charles Lister, the director of Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., the conversation I had outlined looked a little different than what we ended up with. Initially, we were going to talk about the reasons that Syria had fallen from the headlines, despite an ongoing civil war, increased attacks on Iranian and Hezbollah forces by Israel inside Syria, and an ongoing humanitarian crisis that is one of the worst in the world. In the days leading up to our conversation, the world, however, was forced to pay attention again. As rebel forces swept into Aleppo, the world, and seemingly Assad's forces as well, were shocked by the speed and efficiency of this offensive. So, before we dive into the rapidly changing situation on the ground, let's remind our listeners about how we got to where we are today.
An awful lot has happened in Syria, and it's hard to summarize it in a nutshell, but yeah, in 2011, as the Arab Spring protests were spreading across parts of the Middle East, Syrians took to the streets too. Men, women, and children took to the streets in early 2011. Initially, they were demanding for political reforms, but the regime was pretty unforgiving in its immediate crackdown on those peaceful protests. The increasingly violent response from the regime basically led to the inevitable militarizing of the uprising itself. So by mid-2011, we were seeing early signs of armed resistance. The conflict basically exponentially escalated from there through 2011 into 2012, 13, 14. In those early years, we began to see external players intervene. The US got involved from 2012. Hezbollah, Iran got involved from 2012 and early 2013. The Russians began providing support indirectly from those very early years. And so we found ourselves in a place where by late 2012, there was over 1,000 armed groups in Syria. And those were just the ones fighting the regime. And there were dozens, if not 100 more that were on the regime's side. So conflict was immensely complicated.
This complex environment created space for some of the most devastating fighting seen in modern times and challenged the international community to respond in a way that protected civilians and reined in many of the worst instincts of the Assad regime and its partners. Due to the destruction wreaked in wide swaths of the country, millions of people were displaced, creating a mass exodus of people to neighboring countries and beyond. However, these loosely aligned groups continued to pressure the Assad military forces until...
Ultimately, by 2015, the regime was so vulnerable that both the Russians and the Iranians thought that it was possible the regime might implode, and that led to a Russian military intervention in September 2015. Now, at that point, the US and its Western allies were mostly fixated on pushing back against ISIS, ISIS being more of a symptom of the crisis, not obviously a cause. But by being distracted, we kind of created a vacuum into which the Russians could intervene without any real resistance. Russia intervened directly to combat the groups we had long supported. And that was a real game-changing development. That eventually gave the regime the kind of breathing space that allowed it to pick off opposition-held areas of the country one by one, including Aleppo city, which was taken at the end of 2016, areas in the south of Syria, in Homs in the center of the country, and in and around Damascus were all taken by 2018.
Around this time, it seemed to the outside world that Assad had won the war and would inevitably retake full control of the country. This was highlighted by the Trump administration's decision to remove U.S. troops from northern Syria in December of 2018, and again in October of 2019. Although President Trump was convinced to leave around 200 to 400 U.S. troops in the country, which ended up probably being closer to around 900 troops that we see today. The U.S. was not the only country to take its eye off the Syrian conflict, and by 2020,
we found ourselves in a place where the regime was proclaiming itself the victor, but still only ruled over roughly 50% of the Syrian population, around 60% of the country. But certainly from the international community's perspective, this was a sort of somewhat convenient conclusion that allowed it to feel like it didn't need to reinvest or double down on Syria policy. And we've been in this kind of stagnant place ever since, where the conflict has been described as frozen. But of course, there's been a lot going on under the scenes.
Before we move any further ahead in this timeline, let's dive a little into the groups that were opposing the Assad regime. As Charles mentioned previously, there were over 1,000 groups fighting the government and its allies, so we will focus on the broad coalition and some of the specific forces leading the fight, both militarily and politically.
On the political side, we had the Syrian political opposition, which was formed very early on in the uprising in 2011 and early 2012. It was a broad spectrum kind of coalition, mostly made up of Syria's long exiled political thinker class, all of whom had been forced out of the country because they had political views. That was essentially not allowed under the Syrian regime. So they put together the political opposition, but inside the country was where Syrian residents, and mostly obviously men, initially formed what were village protection militias, and this was in 2011. And those militias were formed to protect the protests initially. And they were formed by your average man from Community A, along with a very large number of defecting Syrian military officers. So by mid-2012, nearly 100,000 Syrian soldiers had defected and pledged themselves to the Syrian opposition. Now, that mass of people, along with many locals, basically associated themselves with what was called the Free Syrian Army. It was a brand that you attached yourself to. It wasn't an organized, cohesive organization, but it was a brand. They attached themselves to what's called the Green Revolutionary Flag, which was an old Syrian flag that was done away with many decades ago. That was what I guess the international community called either the mainstream or the moderate opposition. But it was very complicated. It was this loosely aligned network of militias. On top of that, there developed a more independent, more Islamist leaning, like kind of the Muslim Brotherhood oriented militias. As time passed in 2012, 13 and 14, those armed groups became increasingly influential, in large part because the international community was perceived to not be doing enough to protect Syrian people from the regime's aggression. And that basically reduced the credibility of the most moderate groups in the country that wanted to attach themselves to kind of the pro-democracy movement. And it empowered those groups that had asserted themselves as being more independent in the early years of the crisis. And then on top of that, we had groups on even the more extreme end of the spectrum that were either part of Al-Qaeda, part of ISIS, or who had similar ideologies but didn't attach themselves to either of those organizations. So we had this very broad spectrum of armed groups. Now, to make things even more complicated, the Free Syrian Army, or groups that associated themselves with the FSA, did for very large periods of time fight alongside, in cooperation with, awkwardly, but in cooperation with groups that were aligned with Al-Qaeda. In large part because Al-Qaeda took on this kind of narrative that it wanted to be a support to the Syrian revolution. In fact, their primary group at the time, which was called Jabhat al-Nusra, from Arabic to English, that literally means the support front. They were the front to support the revolution.
This decentralized network of militias was both an advantage and a challenge. While it made it harder for the Assad regime to manage the conflict and identify senior leadership, it also made it harder for the groups to coordinate their actions and for foreign governments to work with such a diverse coalition. With moderate forces working closely with terrorist organizations of all stripes, the United States and its Western allies found it particularly difficult to manage the relationships. But in a very unique twist, all forces, from Assad and his allies to the Syrian defense forces and their Western backers, saw the growing challenge that ISIS posed to local communities, control of Syrian territory, and the global war on terror. This provided an opportunity for a shift in focus, and efforts to roll back the gains of this dangerous group led from all sides.
On the other hand, ISIS, when it first emerged in Syria in 2013, wanted nothing to do with the Syrian revolution. They saw the revolutionaries as apostates, as people who embraced nationalism. And so ISIS, yes, emerged in Syria in a very real way, but very distinctly from the rest of the Syrian opposition, even distinctly from Al-Qaeda. And so, yes, we had this kind of three-way conflict in which we had the Syrian opposition, very broad spectrum. We had the Syrian regime and all of its allies, and then we had ISIS. And that made the conflict all the more complicated from 2014 onwards.
3 years after their emergence, ISIS had lost control of the territory they had seized, and were certainly on the back foot, receding into dark corners, but remaining a global concern. With this victory behind them, many of the groups and forces that had been brought together by the shared enemy began to splinter, with one of the major rifts coming between the United States and Turkey over the involvement of the Kurdish forces, a group viewed by Turkey as an existential threat. Now, we have talked about the Kurdistan Workers' Party in past episodes, so if you want a deeper understanding of these groups, please check out episode 43 of The Global in the Granite State. For now, suffice it to say that Turkey was not happy that the United States was supporting these groups in Syria and wanted the relationship severed as soon as possible.
There had always been that kind of political division way prior to 2011, but it became much more significant once the Syrian crisis began. The group that became dominant amidst that kind of intra-Kurdish competition was a political party called the PYD. And the PYD and its armed wings, I should say, and forgive all the acronyms, the YPG and the YPJ, that's the male armed wing and the female armed wing, were originally established about 25 years ago to be the Syrian wing of what's called the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK. Now, the PKK is an American designated terrorist organization. It has been fighting a 45-year terrorist insurgency against the Turkish government, Turkey happening to be a member of the NATO alliance. And historically, the United States has played a very active role in combating the PKK. In fact, its overall leader, Abdullah Öcalan, is currently sat in a Turkish prison thanks to the CIA. So when ISIS suddenly became this extraordinary challenge in 2014, the US's decision to partner with the PYD, the YPG, and the YPJ was hugely controversial. I mean, the State Department website, the CIA World Factbook at the time, all made it clear that this group was a terrorist organization per US law, and yet our military soldiers were on the ground building an alliance with this organization. That, fast forward a few years, led to these Kurdish groups associating themselves with a broader umbrella. They co-opted and won the support of other minority communities, the Assyrians, some Christian communities, Syriacs, as well as some Arab tribes in northeastern Syria, and thus created something called the Syrian Democratic Forces. That was a kind of rebranding effort to try to present to the world that they were more than just this quite controversial Kurdish militant movement. But nevertheless, it is the YPG that continues to dominate the SDF. I mean, the overall leader of the SDF is a longtime veteran of the PKK, very widely known to have played that role. Yes, he has reoriented himself towards the Syrian issue and sort of removed to a large extent that broader regional Kurdish agenda. But nevertheless, that has created enormous friction with Turkey and has led to repeated Turkish military incursions into northern Syria, a long-running Turkish drone campaign against the SDF. And that's a real challenge for the US. And it has had much bigger ripple effects between the US and Turkey, affecting the war in Ukraine and many, many other issues. So yes, the SDF proved amazing allies, very effective on the ground. They sacrificed a huge amount to deal ISIS a territorial defeat, but there was this very significant negative knock-on effect in terms of our partnership with them.
The issue continued for several years, even coming up as a challenge during Sweden and Norway's efforts to join the NATO alliance, with Turkey accusing both of supporting Kurdish terrorist groups. So, for anyone who thinks that localized conflicts do not have global connections, this illustrates how deep the roots of conflict can spread around the world. This is also true on the side of the Assad regime and its partners, as the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, and Israel have all impacted each other in varying ways. More on that later, though. One final important note in the history of this conflict is the sheer devastation brought to this country by the various forces. As of March 2023, around 90% of all infrastructure in Syria had been destroyed by this war. In addition, over 14 million Syrians have been displaced from their homes, constituting the world's largest refugee crisis, which continues to upend and destroy lives today.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, I mean, many times when I talk about the numbers of Syria, I say Syria's been a war of vast numbers. I mean, many unprecedented in a row. At least 500,000 Syrians have died since 2011 in the violence. 130,000 Syrians remain missing, almost all of them at some point arbitrarily detained by the Syrian regime and thus assumed disappeared. For a long time, the biggest prison in Damascus, in the capital, had an industrial-sized crematorium to dispose of bodies executed for all manners of opposition activities, from protesting or social media messages or anything else. So an enormous scale of murder, frankly, and death. Roughly 50% of Syria's basic infrastructure has been destroyed in the war, the vast majority by massive sort of strategic bombing by the regime and latterly by the Russian government. Roughly 7 million Syrians are currently refugees outside of the country. Almost exactly the same number are internally displaced. That represents roughly 50% of the entire Syrian population. The humanitarian needs in Syria today are higher than they've ever been. And yet, at the same time, given how many other conflicts and crises there are around the world, the United Nations, which manages the aid response in Syria, their budget that is designed to meet the minimum needs in Syria is only 25% filled. So you can only imagine that dramatic shortfall in terms of humanitarian assistance, what kind of an effect that has on the ground. But on top of that, we've had 341 verified chemical weapons attacks, 339 of them by the Syrian regime, and 2 very rudimentary experimentary attacks by ISIS. 82,000 barrel bombs dropped by the regime. Those are just large metal barrels filled with homemade explosives, nuts, bolts, and nails. And then they're literally rolled off the back of a helicopter. So there's absolutely no guidance mechanism involved here. And they're just rolled over the back of a helicopter into big towns and cities. You know, one barrel bomb can flatten an entire street, and 82,000 of them were dropped between 2012 and 2016. So, yeah, I mean, it's just catastrophic in terms of the human cost, the physical infrastructure cost, and the fact that the regime still stands means that none of this is getting fixed. The regime doesn't get the reward of reconstruction simply for still being there. And so, obviously, that means that Syria remains a complete catastrophe.
It is important to note here that these are not just numbers. These are individuals, families, communities, and more. The generational impact of this war cannot be minimized, and at the same time, the extremely personal impact of this devastation cannot be underestimated. Before the war, Syria was a much different country, unsurprisingly, despite the long and brutal rule of the Assad family. Bashir was preceded as ruler by his father Hafez, neither of which made life easy for their people. However, there were vibrant cities filled with people who yearned for a better life, just like in cities around the world. It was a multi-ethnic country that attracted tourists to its ancient history sites, many of which have been destroyed by fighting and specific targeting by different groups. Just take a quick look online at many of the stories shared by Syrians forced to leave their country and the beauty that existed in this country before this catastrophic war. A war that continues today.
In early 2020, the Syrian regime faced a situation in which the only sizable pocket of opposition territory that remained outside of its control, by the way, not including the Kurdish SDF region of the northeast, but poor opposition that had been fighting the regime since 2011, was in the northwest of the country. And in 2020, the Syrian regime, with very heavy Russian backing and Iranian backing, launched a major offensive to try to take that pocket. Mostly it's the province of Idlib in the northwest, but there's also parts of several neighboring provinces that are also under the opposition control. That offensive was catastrophic in terms of the instability it resulted in. I mean, in about 10 days, 1 million people were displaced. That is almost unprecedented anywhere in the world in terms of a scale of so rapid displacement. As a result of that, the Turkish military intervened for the first time ever. It intervened directly against the Syrian regime, and in a week caused the regime somewhat catastrophic losses. That forced the Russians to come to the table and introduce a ceasefire in northwestern Syria that has basically held, I mean, albeit very unstably, but has basically held the lines of control since early 2020.
Very unstably, especially with much of the world turning its attention to other issues, including the COVID-19 pandemic, the second Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Israel-Gaza-Hezbollah wars. Quick note here for reference, this episode was recorded on December 2nd.
All of that went out the window about a week ago when the kind of broad coalition of armed groups in northwestern Syria launched a surprise offensive that was initially quite limited in terms of its agenda. It wanted to take the countryside that lies to the west of Aleppo city, from which the Syrian regime had been indiscriminately shelling civilian communities for the last several years. And it called this offensive Operation Deter Aggression. It was initially very limited and it just wanted to seal this countryside, but the regime lines just collapsed one after the other. And that led to a very sudden and dramatic expansion of the agenda behind this campaign, in which we've seen Aleppo city, Syria's second biggest city, fall in 24 hours. Bear in mind that the regime fought for 5 years to take back half of that city earlier on in the crisis. So falling in a day is absolutely unbelievable. And those armed groups have continued to expand. They've sealed up all of Idlib Governorate, all province, almost all of Aleppo province too, and they're now in the province of Hama to the south.
While it's understandable that these other major global issues may have sapped interest in what was going on in Syria at the time, there were also many people writing articles at the time indicating that the stalemate was a good thing and that it was fine to let Assad, Russia, and Iran claim victory despite it not being complete. With the world distracted, there were
hugely consequential changes for the Syrian crisis, but the reason they've happened is because Syria has been, as I said earlier, basically left to stagnate. The crisis was 1 million miles from being over. All of the situations that the world worries about, from terrorism, violence, instability, the drugs trade, which has become an enormous regime-sponsored issue, the refugee crisis, the humanitarian crisis, all of those issues have worsened every single year for the last 5 years. And yet there's been no effort to resolve any of them. And that sort of stagnation created the conditions in which the armed opposition said, well, we're not finished. We haven't given up here. And they've spent the last 4 years methodically training and preparing themselves and increasing their abilities, their capabilities to launch something like what we're seeing today, which frankly, again, as someone who really specializes in the armed opposition and the conflict itself, the military conflict, these groups have demonstrated a way superior level of sort of professionalism and expertise than they did in the major phase of armed conflict between 2011 and 2020. And that had a very dramatic effect on the battlefield, and it's fundamentally changed the map.
One of the interesting developments here is the impact that other wars have played, directly or indirectly, on the Syrian civil war. This is most specifically clear in the recent increase in Israel's efforts to target Hezbollah, both in Lebanon and Syria, which has also included targeting Iranian forces there. With that conflict now settled by ceasefire, it will be interesting to see how it changes the focus in Syria, and if Iran and Hezbollah will refocus on supporting the Assad regime. The survival of this regime remains important to both these groups, as Syria acts as a main transit route between Iran and Lebanon. So, if Assad falls, that complicates Iran's efforts to resupply Hezbollah in the wake of its largest war with Israel in over a decade. Prior to the ceasefire, despite reports to the contrary, the war between Israel and Hezbollah did not change the realities in Syria all that much, as Israel has been attacking Syria for over a decade, and the rumors of Hezbollah pulling forces off the front lines in Syria seem to have been oversold.
Obviously, the Middle East has seen its fair share of major regional conflict over the last year or so, and Iran, as an actor that has played a very significant role in Syria, alongside its key partner from Lebanon, Hezbollah, have both been under the Israeli target set, particularly since the war in Lebanon developed in the latter half of this year. And that's unquestionably had an impact, particularly on Hezbollah's ability to dedicate the level of senior forces, senior commanders, to the Syrian battlefield. Although, honestly, it hasn't had a dramatic impact on their presence on Syrian front lines. In fact, this is where sort of regional politics comes into play and things get a little complicated, but there has been a big push amidst conflict in Lebanon by certain states in the region, certain governments in the region, to push a kind of policy agenda that would convince Israel and the United States to pressure these actors in order to prevent them from having a presence on Syrian soil. And part of that would mean rewarding the Syrian regime if it was able to accomplish this. That kind of agenda, little of which has been public, has meant that a lot of Arabic language media, most of which is backed by governments, it's sort of state media, has pushed various rumors, frankly, that, Hezbollah's withdrawn all of its forces from this area of Syria. And, the IRGC, Iran's military, has had to withdraw all of its senior personnel from this area of Syria. But frankly speaking, as someone who monitors all of this on a very granular scale every hour of the day, there's really been no evidence for any of that. Hezbollah has remained on all of the front lines it's always been on. The IRGC and Iranian military commanders exactly the same. If there has been an effect, it's been that they've been distracted, but it hasn't been some kind of dramatic withdrawal of forces. And I would argue probably that the distraction has provided opportunities for opposition actors in particular to push the envelope in other areas and try and take advantage of those distractions.
The same is true for Russian support for the Assad regime, which allows for an important Russian naval base on its territory, despite its ongoing war in Ukraine.
Again, there was a lot of rumors that initially sort of disseminated into Western media, English language media, that suggested Russia had sort of dramatically withdrawn its forces from Syria in response to the pressures it was facing in Ukraine. But again, we haven't really seen any evidence of that. On the Russian side, the evidence that we have seen is that whereas prior to the war in Ukraine, Russia's best military officers, its best generals, were being dispatched to Syria for 9 to 12-month deployments in order to basically run the military campaign in Syria. Now, those best officers and the best generals have been moved to focus on Ukraine. And I think on the kind of professionalism level, on the military experience level, that's had an impact on Russia's ability to command and coordinate quite as effectively as it had done prior to the war in Ukraine. But troop levels, fighter jet levels, air defense levels have actually all remained the same. Again, they've stayed on the same front lines. What we have seen is a very significant reduction in Russia's ability to manage the situation. And beyond managing it, we've seen a reduction in Russia's ability to, for want of a better term, kind of manipulate it, point the Syrian crisis in another direction by creating big strategic initiatives, whether they're diplomatic or military or otherwise. We haven't really seen any of that.
So, understanding that no one has a crystal ball here, what does the future hold in the coming days, weeks, and months as the rebels push their advantage and the regime formulates its own strategy? However, as we have seen recently, without a diplomatic solution to the issue, it is impossible to envision an end to the hostilities. There have been some efforts at coming to a diplomatic solution here, but none have gone overly well.
6 months ago, the Turkish government announced publicly that it was open to exploring a normalizing of ties between the Turkish government and the Syrian regime. In response to that, the Syrian regime was completely obstinate, refused to enter into any form of meaningful negotiation over what that normalization would look like. And so, cutting a long story short, the normalization initiative completely failed. As a result of that, I think Turkey sees these developments as an invaluable opportunity to boost its negotiating position with the Syrian regime, with its Russian and Iranian backers, and perhaps try to push forward a meaningful political process on Syria. But it's very early days. That would be potentially an enormously significant and potentially positive development for Syria, because we haven't had any meaningful diplomacy in a long time. But I think we're going to have to wait a little longer before being overly sort of confident about those predictions.
In the absence of a negotiated solution, the war will continue to grind on and take more lives. It allows the Assad regime to continue its indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations, it allows him to continue disappearing anyone he wants with no accountability, and it allows this crisis to continue to displace millions of people, destroying any hope for a future.
I mean, this is a regime that is still arbitrarily detaining people for crimes of negligible significance. Just last week, a man in southern Syria was traveling to Damascus because his son, his very young son, has cancer. And he was traveling to Damascus, the capital, to get his son chemotherapy. They were both arbitrarily detained, the cancer-ridden son and his father, for a week, just simply because they came from a village that had a long-standing tie with the armed opposition. That basically ceased to exist in 2018, 6 years ago, but that history was enough to get that man and his very poorly son detained for a week.
For those wondering, and I'm guessing that if you have made it this far in the conversation, you're not one of those people, there are many reasons that the world, the United States, and its partners should care about this ongoing conflict.
That's just one of thousands of examples just over the last year. And if that behavior continues, 7 million Syrian refugees are never going to return. And that is causing an immense economic strain on our partners in the region, like Jordan, for example, and Lebanon, which is coming out of a debilitating conflict, and Turkey, of course. So there's that side of things. There's lots of other side effects or symptoms of leaving Syria's crisis unresolved. ISIS was a very dramatic one in 2014. The reason why ISIS became the extraordinary, biggest, most powerful terrorist organization the world has ever seen is because of Syria's crisis and the scale and scope of Syria's crisis. ISIS found in Syria an enormous vacuum and an opportunity to grow. It found a narrative to be able to recruit, which wasn't just the establishment of what it called an Islamic State, but was to recruit people from around the world to fight the Syrian regime, which was killing 100 people a week at the time. So ISIS right now, having been territorially defeated in 2019, is resurgent. It's on track right now to triple the number of its attacks in Syria this year compared to 2023. That is a dramatic resurgence. But they are doing that because the Syrian crisis remains unresolved. There's the drugs issue, which I hinted at earlier. The Syrian regime has become the biggest narco state in the world over the last several years. As a result of the fact that the Syrian pound basically became meaningless, it has found its ability to industrially manufacture illegal amphetamines and smuggle them around the world for a profit of roughly $3 billion a year. That's about 20 times Syria's annual GDP. Now, that money isn't going to the Syrian state. It's certainly not going to the Syrian people. It is going to the regime, the elite that surround Bashar al-Assad. And it is the kind of glue that is holding the regime together. Now, but those drugs are creating a regional health crisis that's never existed in the Middle East in terms of mass drug addiction. And that has an impact on the US, as would another refugee crisis, which could happen if the hostilities in the northwest of Syria continue in the way that they are. So for all of those reasons and many, 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 many others, the US does have, I think, quite an urgent need to be involved in trying to resolve this crisis, because the longer it festers, the more it will continue to blow up.
This means dealing with the underlying issues that are driving the ongoing civil war. And it's not as simple as one side or the other claiming they have defeated the other, regardless of the facts on the ground. There are major long-term issues that need to be resolved, which will require deep conversations and collective effort to solve.
Big picture, yes, we absolutely want it to be resolved and off the table. The problem is that just leaving Assad as the so-called victor, and I'll come back to the so-called bit in a minute, but just leaving Assad to be the so-called victor didn't mean that the crisis was resolved, as we are now seeing play out in a very dramatic fashion. Assad did proclaim himself the victor in Syria over the recent years, but what he's frankly managed to do is survive. But he has survived with a carcass of a state. I mean, there's no economy to speak of. The Syrian pound is essentially meaningless. 15,000 Syrian pounds equals $1 today. The average salary in Syria amounts to around $10 a month. And so there's no economy to speak of. The infrastructure, as I said earlier, is basically non-existent. And as we're seeing play out in the northwest of Syria right now, militarily, even militarily, which is a priority for the Syrian regime, the Syrian military is so fragmented that it's barely able to hold together a meaningful front line. So there's a real consequence to that. What the US government needs to acknowledge isn't just that Syria may destabilize again one day, which we may be seeing play out right now, but that the reason why it might destabilize again one day is because the underlying crisis hasn't been resolved. And yes, that means tackling the issue of the Syrian regime.
Knowing that we need to solve this crisis, what are the challenges that the US faces in terms of leading this effort?
The timing here is very inconvenient from a US perspective, because, of course, we've got an outgoing Biden administration that really doesn't want to have to be dealing with another Middle East crisis in its last weeks of office. And we've got an incoming Trump administration, which, as with all administrations, will take at least 6 months to come together from January and begin to be able to implement its own new approaches to situations like this. So we've had a statement from the US State Department, which was kind of meaningless. I mean, it was kind of, we're concerned about the escalation, we encourage de-escalation. This has happened because the Assad regime remains a core part of the problem in Syria, but no real kind of policy involvement. There's no US diplomacy involved in trying to resolve any of this. We're not getting involved, which frankly is, as I described a little earlier, more or less the norm from the US and from European governments for the last several years. There is a sense to which still, despite the significance of events, the crisis in Syria isn't a direct national security threat to the United States homeland, and that therefore it still remains a kind of containable crisis that doesn't require significant US investment. I would say that's profoundly naive, given what has happened and emanated from Syria in the past, which has fundamentally transformed US national security interests and the interests of our closest allies and partners around the world. But, we are where we are. So we're not going to get a US government coming out and celebrating the gains being made right now. Although, yes, behind the scenes, those officials in the US government who are 24/7 working on the Syria file won't be unhappy to see the regime being put under pressure, because that could help, as I said a few minutes ago, that could help to encourage movement on the diplomatic file, which is, what we've all needed and wanted for so long.
As we wrap up this conversation, I want to leave you with these final thoughts from Charles about the importance of the right kind of global engagement and leadership from the United States. Without a doubt, when we are not involved in international affairs, countries who don't have our interests in mind take the lead and can cause as much, and many times much more, harm than was otherwise necessary.
I would just stress that, yes, the world seems so unstable these days, and that's true. And yes, we have a ton of problems on our own doorstep that need resolving. And yes, that's absolutely true. But the United States cannot continue to be safe and thriving and part of an integral part of the international community. It can't be an actor with real international credibility if we just seal ourselves up from the problems of the world. Now, that does not mean in any way that the US needs to be the world's policeman. That is not true either. But we need to be part of the solution to crises like this. And listen, the horrific Hamas October the 7th attack from Gaza attracted a huge amount, and rightfully so, of American attention, as did the resulting Israeli war on the Gaza Strip. But a large reason why that horrific attack happened was because the US and the international community had basically abandoned the entire Israeli-Palestinian issue. The Abraham Accords, which I'm sure you must have talked about in other podcasts, was in theory a great initiative to integrate Israel into the region. But by totally sidelining the Palestinian issue, it created the conditions in which extremist actors, the worst actors, will always lash out. And they did that in the most dramatic fashion. Syria is no different. All of those issues, terrorism, instability, humanitarian crisis, refugee flows, all of those things, drugs and everything else, will continue to explode out of Syria's territory if it isn't resolved. And just to give some sort of historical context here, in 2014, when the major refugee flows began out of Syria and headed towards Europe, those refugee flows completely transformed European politics. They led to Brexit and the UK's exit from the European Union. They led to the horrific and really major tensions between Turkey and Europe and Turkey within NATO. They led, I think, to the triggering of far-right populist politics, first in Southern Europe, then in Central Europe, then in Northwestern Europe, and I think also in the United States. And that all came from Syria. And that's before we mention ISIS and the fact that it's now the biggest and most spread out global terrorist organization we've ever seen. And that's a whole nother issue that doesn't get nearly enough attention in terms of the challenge. But it's all because of Syria. So there is one rule here in Syria, which is what happens in Syria never stays in Syria.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Global in the Granite State podcast, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We appreciate your interest and engagement in these important conversations and that you play your role in shaping the world, one discussion at a time. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, follow, and support our work. Share this with your friends and family, as the more people who engage, the more informed the world will be. If you can, show the value you find in our work by donating at wacnh.org/donate. As always, Tim Horgan is the driving force behind this podcast, directing, producing, editing, recording, researching, fact-checking, hosting, and everything else needed to make this possible. Our theme music is Admin by A.A. Alto, and our interlude music is Price of Freedom by Good B Music. Thanks for joining, and hope to see you in the new year.